Hello, and welcome to the School Governance Network. My name is Michael Iannini, and I'm joined by my co-facilitator, Paul Smith. Today, we're here to talk about how to host a great AGM, and in particular, how AGMs are so vital to the role of governance. But one thing that we're both concerned about, and why we wanted to make this a topic for today's webinar, is that with many of the schools that tune into our webcasts might actually experience, is that their AGMs are underattended. They're not as meaningful or as impactful as they would like. And we want to really reinforce that point that, these are opportunities to engage the community, but they should also be part of a longer term communication strategy. So we're going to be looking to really reinforce that. But before we go into the topic for today, I just want to give a little background about the School Governance Network that Paul and I have been working very hard to develop for governors across Asia and globally for that matter, as we have many people joining in from Europe and the United States and even South America. For the Governance Network, Paul and I really see it as our opportunity to engage with schools to help them understand best governance practices, to help introduce what's going on in other industries, bring those practices and show how they actually can be applied within the school setting. Many of the governors do come already from corporate backgrounds, but when they put themselves into that school governance role, they often are conflicted about what would be appropriate or what wouldn't be appropriate. So in many cases, these webinars and newscasts that we do on a monthly basis tend to be very reassuring and affirm their beliefs and can be a source of confidence. In another respect, though, we're helping to orientate them to those roles. So there is a lot of very valuable training content here. And where you can find that information is through joining our LinkedIn group, School Governance Network, where Paul and I post weekly on various news items that we think actually have an effect on school governance. We also have a repository of webinars over the last 6 months and newscasts where we try to explore news through the lens of the school boardroom, and we present that on a monthly basis as well. So you can find those at our YouTube channel. You can find those also in our LinkedIn group. What I want to do is now start to look at what our objectives for today are. Pretty much what we're looking at is 4 main items. Why do we have the AGM? The key challenges of the AGM, and best practice objectives for your school AGM. Then finally, Paul's going to enlighten us on the key ingredients of a world-class AGM, something to put it all together. And I'm really excited to get engaged in this topic because it's very practical and it's very relevant to what's going to be happening in the next 2 months for many of you. With that said, hey, Paul, would you mind answering that essential question? Why do we have an AGM?
Thanks, Michael, for that great introduction as well. And just let anybody know who's on there, we're happy to take questions at any point during the session. Look, why do we have an AGM? Typically, there's a legal responsibility and a compliance with an Articles of Association. But it's really interesting as you go through schools or Articles of Association, the mention of the AGM just mentions the very basic formalities and the need from a timing perspective. And also in terms of accreditors, whether it's a Department of Education or an international schools body or whoever it happens to be, often they don't even mention the AGM. So the legal compliance side of things is there, but it doesn't really give any flavour. Obviously, there's the reporting aspect and the elections as well of governors to the role. And the reporting activities can be varied, but it tends to be focused on, the report for the year, any sort of infrastructure, school improvements, and also achievements of students. And it tends to involve both the board of governors and some of the senior staff, especially just the head of school. So that's sort of why we have an AGM in terms of from where most people are coming from. But really, why do we have an AGM? It's all about engagement. In our view, it's all about engaging with your key stakeholders. And which stakeholders are the most important ones? We're actually going to come to that pretty soon. But That's really the objective of an AGM, is like it's a chance to actually interact and engage with our stakeholders. Before we move on, though, I'd like to just talk about some of the key challenges. Michael mentioned at the front, that how vital for school governance AGMs can be, but often they're not delivered in a way that really maximises the opportunity. And there's lots of reasons, why. But here are some of the key challenges, and we'll get to the reasons. One, they're underattended. People don't tend to turn up. Often you don't get many people at all, apart from some of the activists coming along. They're not well planned out, and we'll get to why that is. They don't communicate a vision or, reinforce a vision for the school. It turns into a bit of a talk fest. So there's not much interaction going on between the audience and the board and management. They're not designed to inspire people into action or knowledge. For a knowledge organization like a school, every interaction can be treated as a learning experience. And often they're too focused on the formalities, just getting through the basics and getting through them, and then so we can all go home. So why is that, though? Well, it comes down to the usual things: a lack of time and a lack of money, and definitely a lack of time. But also, I think the time side comes in when there's actually a lack of a formula. There's actually lack of a plan and some guiding principles about that. And as I mentioned beforehand, there's not a lot of information out there about how to conduct an AGM. Like, yes, the bits that you do need to have in the AGM, the formalities, but how to actually put one together. And that's the problem we're trying to solve today with the webinar and that sort of things. But also, as I said beforehand, AGMs can often be treated as an afterthought and often an annoyance. Like, we've got to run this AGM. Okay, let's put some stuff together. Let's put out the notice in due course. Make sure we hit our notice period, so we anything there, and then we'll just make it happen and hope we just get through it, and then we can move on with our normal roles. And again, I think that's the shift in mindset that you need to have in terms of what would be best practice. And essentially, if you fail to prepare, you are preparing to fail. I love this little graphic. I use it in lots of different things when it comes to being a board director in the first place. The more prepared you can be, the more you're going to get out of this experience. And obviously, with those key challenges of time and resources and having a lack of strategy, the more effort you can put in now, the more it's going to pay off later on. So what are best practice objectives for your school board AGM? So you should focus on increasing stakeholder engagement, and we'll get into that, what that means in terms of who the stakeholder is. You should always be setting out or reinforcing the school's vision or mission statement. You should be communicating the strategic plan if there is one. Now, if you don't have a strategic plan in terms of what you're looking to be doing over the next 3, 5, 10 years, it's really important for all schools to develop a strategic plan and then communicate that to the community. Most importantly, though, is to treat this as part of an ongoing communication strategy instead of a one-off event. And as I've written at the bottom there, incorporate into your annual event and communications plan. So, in that respect, AGMs are pivotal. They're both the beginning and the end. If you think about it, they can be treated that way. They're the end in terms of reporting posthumously about what has happened, but they can also be the beginning in terms of communicating what's to come, and whether that's everything from vision to more practical side of things in terms of infrastructure changes, curriculum changes, whatever it happens to be. So again, treat the AGM like it's a part of the ongoing communications and event cycle, and that will shift your mindset into starting to deliver something which is of real value as opposed to an afterthought. So what I want to do now is I've used a sort of a cookie analogy about what are the key ingredients of a world-class AGM. Now, there's from our point of view, there's 7. They may not be exactly what you think they are. I've sort of taken away sort of like the basics, like, understand your legal obligations. That's a given. These are the sort of things that you maybe not be thinking about so much. And if you are, fantastic. Hopefully you'll get a few more key points here. So the first one is to know your audience. Really, really simply, it's, understand whom you are talking to. It's very often easy to think that we're just talking to ourselves, but who are the people you're trying to invite to the AGM? How are they going to interact with you? And what are they actually really after in terms of information, and the way that they will absorb that information? So this is a great slide that we used in our last webinar last month on board evaluations and health checks. And Michael, what we've done here, this is the one we had for in terms of identifying the key audiences. But Michael, I'd love you to take us through what we've done and change this to the AGM version.
So when you reflect on stakeholder mapping, what you're looking at is you're taking a specific topic and you're just trying to understand how it impacts different members of your community. So in the case of the board health check, Paul, if you can go back a slide, you can quickly see that based on the board health check, management is really the central focus on a board health check, largely because they have the largest amount of interaction with the board. So they're going to be able to provide probably the most relevant feedback. That said, the board also is very important in that role. The next lens that often is very critical of boards would be that of the accreditators, accreditation agencies and associations. Next, you'd have staff. Generally, staff don't have a direct connection with the board, depending on how the board is structured and the activities it engages in. And then, last is community. But ultimately, all these stakeholders are identified as important. So now when we go to the next slide, which is looking at for the AGM, everything's reversed. It's a complete flip, because this is the chance for the community to get in touch with the board. And when we put the community at the center of our stakeholder map, it completely changes the narrative for what the AGM is about. It's no longer about renewing the board and attending to those fiduciary responsibilities. It's really about the community and connecting them to it and getting them more involved in the school. And I would say that's probably one of the most crucial responsibilities that a board has in terms of being responsive to the community.
Thanks, Mike. That's exactly right. And what's really important here as well, and it actually leads us to the second key ingredient, is that that secondary core stakeholder, which is the staff. Now, what you don't want in your AGM is staff coming along who are hearing things for the first time. So what you might want to do, and this is how one of the second ingredients of hosting world-class AGM, is have a practice session with your staff. So they actually get to hear things, not for the first time. Well, they hear them for the first time in the practice session, but when it comes to the actual AGM, you'll have advocates in the room who actually understand what's coming up. Plus, you get to have a practice session in front of a, let's say a friendlier audience. I'm not saying they're all going to be too hugely friendly, but they're still going to have key questions, but you get to practice everything. And that will actually mean, and we're going to cover off what it means in terms of practice later on, but there's a real good ingredient here about running a practice session for staff. And again, we often don't practice our AGMs. You might find individuals practicing their presentations or speeches, but we often don't find AGMs are practiced. And again, this is all about the key ingredients of world class. What do the best do? And the best give it a run through. But again, instead of doing it a run through just by yourselves, run it through with staff so you can turn them into advocates. So that's our first two ingredients out of 7. And the next one is something I've already mentioned, which is to incorporate this into your annual communications plan. Now, don't look at this. This is all meaningless. It's just a screenshot from something else. But essentially, here you've got a multimedia approach through emails, through social media, through media releases, all that sort of side of things. But essentially, you're going to have a communications plan as a school with your community. and obviously that's largely parents. And that could be social media, newsletters, like flyer drops into book bags, with the kids, through the website. You might also, just going back interestingly to our board health checks, we talked about actually you may, if you really want to get deep with your board health check, you can actually involve the community in that board health check. So again, there's another level of engagement with the audience. So again, you're going to have multiple points of contact throughout the year. And the trick here is it doesn't become a one-off invitation to the AGM saying, right, here's the AGM, here we are. We're actually building anticipation to the purpose of the AGM. We are building anticipation to what you're going to get out of the AGM. And again, if your school has a marketing department or someone with marketing expertise, get them involved at this point and see how the board and management can incorporate AGM planning and communications into the sort of the marketing of the school or the communications of the school. Like, your marketing people are going to be some of the best people in terms of, or your communications people, the best people to potentially engage in this at this level.
Hey, Paul, if you don't mind interjecting, there is something that I read recently, and it's a message that I always try to reinforce when I'm working with strategic planning or leadership, is that there's nothing wrong with over communicating. In fact, things that are important need to be communicated several times in several ways, because people, they respond to different forms of communication. The problem with schools is that their communication strategies aren't coherent. They're very disparate, and they're not coming from very reliable channels or sources. So, in building upon what Paul was just talking about there, making the AGM part of that communication strategy and building up to having it be that focal point where at the end of the year it just brings everything together, is an incredibly powerful tool to connect all the communications that are going on. It creates a focal point in many ways, brings the community back together so that not only can you report on what's going on, but you can renew and refresh the community for the next school year. But in any case, Paul, you just kind of inspired this thought in my mind that it also it drives home the point. There's nothing wrong with over communicating. You just need to make sure your communication strategies are coherent. Sorry for butting in there.
No. It's exactly a great point. And there's a little phrase that a marketing person once taught me. It says, the moment your marketing team is getting bored with the message, it's the time to double your efforts. Because essentially, you whilst you're seeing every single message as an employee or part of that team developing the communication, your audience is only probably seeing 1 in 5, 1 in 10 messages, and they're not taking it in. So you have to actually, you have to over and over again. And the more the different style of communication, whether it's a Facebook group or a channel or the website or newsletter or printed, whatever it happens to be, the more you can do it, the better it is. As long as it is, as Michael quite rightly says, it's coordinated, and that's a critical element of it. Coordination beats content every single time in this game straight away, making sure that the message is clear, and you think about the audience in terms of how they're engaging with it. So there's our first three. Again, the last one there is treating the AGM as a pivotal part of the annual communications plan. Now, the next one may seem a little bit sort of like, okay, it's a bit high level, but it's really important to actually be guided by the board's values, but not just the board's values, but also the culture of the school. So when it comes to the board's values, in previous webinars, we've highlighted Nolan's principles. Now, your school will probably have its own values at a school level from an educational point of view. Maybe your board has values and mission. And again, if it doesn't, like the strategic plan, it's really vital that you have a set of values that guide the interactions of the board with each other, with management, with stakeholders. This is a fantastic set to start with, which is Nolan's principles. So again, these should be guiding principles for how you conduct your AGM as well. And again, especially that accountability, openness, and honesty as well. But also, it's really important that the AGM reflects the culture of the school as well. So if your school's culture is all about creativity and learning, for example, and I'm quoting a school I know, then you want the AGM to reflect creativity and learning. And again, so you want the AGM to be creative in some way, or at least have some creative elements to it, or feel creative, like you really put some thought into it. And it's a learning event as opposed to just a reporting event or an event to elect governors. So again, there's this whole thing of actually being led by your culture and your values, and making sure, if you want this to be a pivotal part of the communication strategy and you really want people to engage with the AGM, that you go back to these principles, these values. And again, if you haven't developed these values yet, if you haven't really thought about them and you're sort of focused on the school's ones, and you might need something slightly different at the board level, it's definitely an activity that you should look into at your next board meeting or incorporate into that board meeting. Michael, do you have something to say? Sorry, I'm not sure.
No, please. I mean, this is something that, Nolan's principles have probably been brought up in the last 2 or 3 webinars, just for the sake of, of how well it just encompasses those key characteristics and attributes.
Yeah. I'll just flip back one there. So the next ingredient is sort of talks to the style of the AGM. Now, as I mentioned beforehand, a lot of AGMs can be quite dry, can be quite formal. And as I said, does this actually reflect the culture of the school? Does it really have to be stuffy and formal and just going through agenda item after agenda item? How can you actually sort of spice up or add flavor, going back to the sort of cooking analogies of ingredients, your AGM? So beyond the sort of the compliance requirements, there's quite a few things you can do to sort of add a bit of flavor. So you can have a guest speaker, for example, or a number of guest speakers. Now, they can be internal and they could be students or staff members in that respect, who are talking about particular projects they've done or things that are coming up, particular changes or new areas or revised areas, refreshed areas, something that's really imparting like a major part of what the school has been up to and I was about to get to. Or they can be external and thinking about your audience. A fantastic one I saw the other day was an expert in neuroscience and resilience in children. And again, they were talking a lot about social media and devices and all the exposure that our kids are getting now and how to do that. And again, it was a fantastic talk for the audience, who were, by and large, parents. So again, it was understanding the audience in that respect. So guest speaker is really, really critical. And again, they can be internal or external. Now, one of the ones I'm really, I love is something a bit more interactive. And Michael's going to give us an example in a minute, but you could run a workshop or a forum which just basically connects the audience with the host of the thing, the board and management. And Michael, you've got an example of a facilitated session that could be run during an AGM.
Yeah, so a school that kind of brings this home right now that I'm working with is in their current accreditation cycle. The reviewers, the evaluators, the visitors, they came away and they reported that they felt that the guiding statements were a bit of a mixed bag. You can kind of choose what you want to justify what you're going to do within the school. They weren't actually guiding; they were more like justifying statements. So they called the school out on it, and they said, this is something you need to revisit within the community, and you need to ensure that they are guiding statements, that there are things that resonate with your community and that the community understands. So let's take a look at the opportunity to do this with the AGM. Let's say, for instance, you've just had this self-study, or you've had this visit, and you want to kind of bring it home. Well, you call together the community for the AGM, and during this visit, what you're doing is you're basically running, which could be an hour to maybe an hour and a half session, where you're grouping up stakeholders. You could either have a grouping strategy where you're looking at a mixture of staff and parents, students as well. And as you have them in these groups, you're basically guiding them through some questions saying, hey, what do you think the purpose of this school is? And, you'd probably be very surprised what a lot of people say. But then, you could use like technology like Padlet. So a session that I'm running has 260 people in it. There's no way I'm going to be able to elicit the feedback from 10 or 20 tables with 260 people. But using technology like Padlet, I can cast their comments up onto a screen that's visible to everybody. And I can basically say, hey, what do you think the purpose of your school is? I want every table to come together with a statement, type it in. Let's post it up onto the Padlet. All right, now let's take a look at our mission, because a mission statement is a statement of purpose. It is your core purpose. And now let's take a look at what everybody thinks the purpose of the school is. And now let's look at what our stated purpose is on our website. And let's kind of look for where the similarities and the disparities are. That can be very, very telling in the sense of, how the school communicates and stays true to that purpose. Then you can do the same thing with the vision. Hey, what are the values that we hold most sacred? What are our core values? And, if you follow my line of thought and you're a big Jim Collins fan, then you understand that the core values are the vision. And so now when we take a look at those core values and all the tables report in, well, hey, let's look at those core values and let's see if they're represented in our vision, potentially in our mission, or in any other guiding statements we have, such as student learning objectives. And here's an excellent opportunity. You could probably even do it in 30 to 45 minutes if you just stop there. But now this sends an incredibly powerful message to your accrediting bodies as well. Because if you can capture evidence of this from Tablet, from the work you're doing in the groups, you're sending a message to the accreditation bodies that, hey, we have measures and means for evaluating our guiding statements, for renewing them within the community and helping our community understand them. And this is just one of those engagements. And the AGM is probably one of the best places where you can call together everybody, lead a session on it, get them bought into it, and then proceed with your other agenda items. So that would be one of the most telling examples.
I would say that's a great thing to do, and it's something you can probably repeat, every 3 to 5 years as well. But again, if you're thinking about if you've already done that in a different forum, some of the other ones you can do using the same format that Michael suggested, whether in a small group or larger groups. Fundraising, you could brainstorm fundraising ideas, something specific about how to manage bad parent behavior. That's one I've actually seen happen as well. They've run a forum with parents about how to manage bad parent behavior. And also things like how to encourage, more diversity of gender in sports and certain subjects at school. So again, like Michael's example, it's just another way of creating interaction with your audience without having to get them together for a separate event. You already hope for them to get them together for this one. It's incorporated, and it really shows and makes a statement of intent that you care and value about what your community has to say and has to offer. And as Michael says, there's also the benefit to the accreditors as well in that respect. So going back to, we've had 5 so far, and I'll just summarize them. So first one so far is know your audience. Understand that your community is the critical audience of your AGM. Make sure you run a practice session for your staff who are that secondary critical audience, and it allows you to really practice the flow and get things going. Obviously, the guest speakers you may not be able to practice with, but it also turns staff into advocates. Treat the AGM as a pivotal part and a key part of the annual communications plan, and plan accordingly, and bring in your communications team into that mix. Always be guided by the board's values and missions, and also the culture of the school itself in terms of when you're setting the agenda and the style of the AGM. And add some flavor to the agenda with some ideas from key speakers and also workshops and forums. One of the other ones I missed actually in my notes here was potentially if you're trying to create a community, you've already got a community always, but if you're trying to create community within a community, speed networking is a great, quick, fun, noisy, energetic way of getting people to interact. And you can just set that up really, really easily by asking key questions and ask people to turn the next person next to them, or you can actually have people introducing them to random strangers. And again, it's also a nice way of actually doing it in a way which doesn't ask people to do it for themselves. People can be nervous at and introverted at a networking event, which is another reason why people don't often come to these things. And it's a way to actually give people the way to interact and meet other people within the community without having to stand around expecting someone to come and talk to them. So it's a lovely little way there. Finally, there is another way, and again, this might be a little bit too far for a lot, but you can change the way the room's set up. I'm assuming this is actually a physical AGM and not a virtual AGM. And again, there's another way of doing it, is actually to turn this into a virtual AGM, similar to what Michael and I are doing with this webinar. You could just do video. You could set up the room differently and actually have the board and management team mingled in amongst the audience, as opposed to set up on a stage or at the front of the room. Now, again, as I said, that takes a lot of practice to get that right, and you have to understand how it all works. But again, you're just changing the orientation to say we're actually part of this community as opposed to us separate from it. So far, some of these may be quite overwhelming. You think, wow, how are we going to put all these together? And I would always just say, like anything else, start small. There's a lovely phrase like, how do you eat an elephant? And they say one bite at a time. So, you don't have to make this some grand event from the first go. Build towards a vision of how you'd like it to be. And obviously with board turnover and refreshment, make sure you're recording this vision of where you would like the AGM to go, so new members take on the mantle and take it on. And again, the more you do this, the better it will become. The AGM will catch on as a community event to attend rather than one to avoid. But also don't brush past the formal stuff. And I would focus on the stuff around that, but don't brush past the really integral parts around reporting and the election of governors. You really have to incorporate those key elements into your planning as well. So next up, and this is probably, for me, the most critical component, and you might not like it, but the more engaged a community becomes, the more they want to know. And that can lead to more questions, and potentially some difficult questions as well. And so you have to be prepared. Going back to preparation is one of my favorite words when it comes to boardrooms and preparing everything. And I've actually worked for organizations that have almost hidden their AGM because they're afraid of some of the questions they're going to get. And it's backfired on them. And if we go back to those Nolan's principles, transparency, openness, accountability is one of those things. And again, it's so critical. And we're talking about anything from a listed company to a non-profit to a school here. Those that hide their AGM because they're worried about what people think about them, it's going to backfire on you. And so it's really, really critical that you get yourself prepared and be ready to answer questions. Now, even if it's a negative a response that, you're not quite there yet, at least you're talking about what you are doing to address this. And the more you can bring out these questions prior to the AGM, the more prepared you can be and the more you can actually get in front of this sort of side of things. So how do you do this practically? Well, as you're planning for your AGM, one of the things you're doing in the board meetings and with management is you're talking about all the things that potentially could be asked. What are some of the issues, both positive and negative, that might come up, or that people are asking us that we're hearing, on the street, as it were. And then you want to sort of start discussing what's our response going to be for this one and how will that land with the audience, but also who will be doing the responding. One of the critical things about if you don't prepare for questions, if a question comes up, you might have the head of school or the chair or the treasurer or a member of staff answering, and they might answer in a very individual way, which actually isn't aligned with the rest of the group. And that gives you two choices: one, to contradict them, or two, to go along with it, even though it's actually not school policy or the actual response you'd give. So, and neither of those are good, because if you contradict them, you don't look very professional as a team. And if you go along with it, well, then you've actually got to go along with it or try and cover it up later on or address it later on. So again, if you can prepare the answers or prepare responses and who will be responding, That's just going to make you look professional, and it's going to build trust with your community, which means you can actually get more done if you've got the trust of your community as a leadership group. So basically, as I said, it builds confidence with your community. So, as I said, oh, I've gone the wrong way. My apologies. Be prepared for all questions. So, what else happens in the agenda? You know, it's all about making it interesting, and you know, making sure that you circulate things before and after and during the meeting. Again, so the more you're prepared with this sort of side of things, you may end up preparing a FAQ prior to the AGM to actually address these things, so you don't get a barrage of questions within the AGM. And actually, interesting, the communications prior but also post the board, the AGM, brings me to the last of the key ingredients, and that's to always remember your post-AGM communications. Now, if you've done, and what the one above says, treat the AGM as a pivotal part of the annual communications plan, if you really have incorporated this, you've thought about what happens after the AGM as well. Because you're going to have a whole bunch of people who are there who need to be followed up with information that you've promised or identified, and that could be simply copies of speeches or the reports, whatever it happens to be. But also, what about the people who weren't there? How are they going to get hold of information? Having communications after the AGM about what happened at the AGM is a fantastic way of actually encouraging people to come next time, but also answer their questions so they're not doing this throughout the rest of the year as well, potentially. Use the same communication tools always. And as I said, you're talking about reports, statements, any sort of FAQs. You could also invite people to submit further questions, and you can actually build up things. You could even, and again, we're getting into the other side of things, you could even get people to rate the AGM, you know, across a number of different criteria to help you benchmark the quality of your AGM. It's all about building on top of what you've done and making things better for you and for the audience. And if you really want to get fancy, you could video the whole thing. And then what you could do is create a highlights package as a tool to engage people with like what happened at the AGM, as well as offer up the entire video of the session. Now, if you've got students who are looking to do some project around videography, and a lot of senior schools will probably have this, bring them in. You know, instead of having to spend thousands of dollars on a video crew and editing, bring your students in and make it a student project, so it becomes part of their portfolio.
You know, so anyway, that is like introduced to governance. I mean, it's also that learning opportunity, right? So
that's perfect. So again, there's lots of reasons. That's actually a really good point. You know, in terms of what you can do as well, is for a school, you know, invite your students to come and attend. You know, especially the ones more senior who are looking to get into, you know, who are involved in committees, school committees, or moving into sort of more leadership within the school. Invite them to come along and see how you guys do it. And hopefully, though, it's done professionally, so it leaves them with a positive impression of how to govern, especially, and how to lead an AGM in that respect in the meeting. So we're coming to near the end, and thank you for sticking with us. It's quite an involved topic, but hopefully you're getting a lot of value out of this. Just want to quickly summarize what we've covered today. So we've covered off, you know, why do we have an AGM in the first place? And we've covered off what many boards look at in terms of the formalities through to best practice. What are the key challenges of your AGM, both in terms of, you know, what boards may be experiencing, schools may be experiencing now, but also how to actually move towards best practice. And obviously, how can we actually create a really engaging and memorable experience which isn't onerous on the school's resources? And I'll just run through those 7 points one last time, just to summarize. Number one, know your audience. Really, really understand who your critical audiences are. Number two, run a practice session with staff only to help practice for you, but also help staff get their questions out in the open to start with, but also become advocates when they're at the AGM. Treat the AGM as a pivotal part of the annual communications plan. It's both the end of a period and also the beginning of another period as well, and it's a great mechanism to engage there. Be guided by the board's values and the school culture when thinking about the style of the AGM and how you actually create some flavour around the agenda. And how do you actually add flavour to the agenda? Have internal, external speakers, run focus groups or brainstorming workshops around critical parts of the school, especially the guiding principles or the mission and values of the school as well. Do speed network. Find ways to interact and build trust with the audience, and so they are confident in you and the leadership of the organisation and school. Be prepared for all questions and make sure you understand who will be answering a particular question or a category of questions, and that these are all agreed or mostly agreed up front as much as possibly can. And also at the end, don't forget to follow up in your communications, not just with those who came, and the more you can actually gather the names of the people who came and not, the better, but also with everybody else who didn't come, and find really good ways to communicate to your audience after the AGM, which builds on for the next year and the next year's AGM. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this webinar. Just one little note here. I'll turn to Michael now to take us through what we had coming up. Michael.
Yep. So recently what we've been doing, because of the response to the webinars, and especially because of where I'm based in Hong Kong and particularly also where Paul is based in New Zealand, we're finding that there are opportunities to meet face-to-face with our audience. So just this month we had a half-day workshop around board health checks, where we had several schools come in and we helped them work through the process in terms of benchmarking their current evaluative processes from having none to actually having some, to what they could do to build on it and to just add greater depth to it. Now, building on this webinar, we actually are meeting again face-to-face with a number of schools. And in this particular case, Paul, you know, the upside is that session is full. But there is no downside, because there's a few people that have responded lately that they'd still like to participate. But as we found out in the last workshop, to try to do interactive session with those that are video casting in as well as those that are in the workshop, it's difficult to attend to those needs of those people that are video casting in, because they're not there. They're really just observers. So what we've decided to do for that same price of admission is basically engage with them in one-on-one coaching sessions. And by one-on-one, actually, you know, you could bring in your board. You could actually bring in other members of the board, and we would work through with you on these various ingredients. So in this webinar, you know, we spoke at a very high level. Obviously, what we do in our workshops and what we'd be doing with you is to then actually survey you around, you know, what are the key topics, what are the critical components for success in terms of your AGM. And then start helping you build that strategy to get the engagement and involvement. So Paul's just kind of put up there in the notes section about where you can find information about that event. But again, awesome, it's full, but hey, that doesn't mean that there's not still potential to assist and help you for that same low price point, because we do want to connect with all of you. It's not just important in terms of building our network, but it's also incredibly important because of what we learned from you. So, you know, if we can make this cost effective and we can help you in a way that really adds value to what you're doing, then, you know, please engage with us. Hey, one last point I'd like to bring up, Paul, before we sign off, is that you have very exciting news. You just recently launched a book, Right Seat, Right Table. And I'd like to take an opportunity to tell our viewers that, hey, check it out. Paul, do you have like a few key words or sentences around like how this helps schools understand not only their orientation of board members, but potentially even selection and recruitment?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm very excited about the launch of my first book. It's all written. I'm actually just finalizing a charity fundraising crowdsourcing campaign with it all, which actually finishes at the weekend. in a few days. So, but essentially, the book is a guide for people how to actually secure their ideal board role. So there's sort of like three parts to the book. One is an argument around diversity in the boardroom and the need for diversity in the boardroom. And then we talk people through what it takes to become an influential board director. So again, this is a book basically, so I won't call it a fantastic read because that's a bit self-promoting, but essentially this is a book for people who are who've just become or becoming board directors, board governors across a number of different types of organizations, whether it's schools, non-profits or a corporate, and about how to develop their unique voice for the boardroom and actually how to go about developing themselves for the boardroom. And the third section sort of starts talking about some of the key challenges faced by new directors. So there's actually, whilst it is a good read for an individual who aspires, or is just joining a board, it's actually really, really interesting for the boards themselves in terms of how to incorporate new people into the boardroom, what they may be looking at, but also like the need for diversity and how you can actually incorporate that into your boardroom, and how you can actually help orientate your new governors so they can quickly get past some of those new challenges of becoming a board director. So hopefully it's helpful. I will bring up so you know what it looks like, a slide. That's what it looks like. Don't worry about that thing at the bottom. As I said, it won't be live for much longer, but again, it will be available from the Future Directors website, and it will be up on Amazon in the coming weeks as well. But again, we'll probably be doing a newscast or something on the book, I suspect, hopefully.
Yep.
That'd be nice. But thank you for mentioning it is on our map. Yeah. So yeah, I'm very, very proud. I'm really happy, and I can't wait to have it out there in as many hands as possible.
All right, so this brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. Record time, 45 minutes. Man, we are getting truly efficient in terms of our delivery. I hope those of you that have tuned in have found great value in it. Paul, if you can just bring up that last slide again in terms of where they can find us. Please search us out in terms of LinkedIn on the School Governance Network. Join the conversation that we're having with several other governors and heads of school in terms about how to improve their school governance. It's also where we share a lot of our resources, so it's a great repository of information of all the different webinars, newscasts, and things that we write about. From me here in Hong Kong, thank you again, Paul.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to sort of really explore this subject as well. So thank you, everybody. I hope you get a lot of value out of it.
Great. All right, then. We'll see you next month when we actually welcome Layla Homestead, and we're going to be talking about a PhD dissertation she did on the most effective forms of governance.
Can't wait.